Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to my Flickers of Fear series. This is where I talk about various movies and whatnot. So let's talk about this. Back in 1968, there was a movie that came out which was directed by Michael Reeves. It was kind of a historical folk horror film called Witchfinder General. Now, Tom and I actually reviewed this on one of our movie time segments or our movie reviews quite a while back. So, if you want to do a search, or I'll put a link to it in the description box. That actually came out in its native UK in 1968. Vincent Price was in it, who, of course, is always amazing. And when it was released in the United States, it was actually called The Conqueror Worm because they were trying to tie it in with the Roger Corman AIP Edgar Allan Poe films that were very popular at that time. So this movie actually took the real life figure of English Witchfinder Matthew Hopkins and kind of did a little bit of lurid torture kind of narrative about it, which are kind of sort of loosely based on his partially fictionalized exploits. Now, this movie was pretty moderately successful, I guess. But what happened in the wake of it was that there seemed to be something of a mini boom in so-called witchsploitation movies. And I guess that was because filmmakers started seeing the financial potential in kind of mining the very horrible things that had happened during the real European witch panics. And they're thinking, well, we can turn this into potentially lucrative movies that have lots of half-naked ladies in them being abused by, leering priests and noblemen and stuff like that. Win-win. So one of the movies that followed after Witchfinder General, probably, I feel like this was easily one of the most notorious exploitation films of the 1970s. It ended up on the UK's infamous Video Nasties list in later years, even though it had initially had 24 minutes of it cut out. Actually, it wasn't even going to be passed at all because they're like, oh, if we cut out everything we had to cut out, there won't be any movie left. But I think they did eventually release it with 24 minutes cut out. I think you can get it uncut now, but you know what I mean, back then. And it also got itself banned in several countries. And actually, I'm not entirely sure, but it might still be banned in a few countries. I'm not entirely certain about that. So the movie that we're talking about, obviously, is Mark of the Devil from 1970. Now, this was a West German production. And the original title of it, the German of which I am not even going to attempt to pronounce, but the literal title translated into English is Witches Tortured Till They Bleed, which I thought was very funny. So, obviously the film isn't all that shocking by today's standards, but given the context of the time, it was pretty rough. So you could see kind of, why there was such a big buzz about it. Although I would argue that maybe a large part of its infamy, I guess, probably stemmed from the admittedly pretty brilliant marketing campaign. They had a great poster for it, and it kind of made a big show of the movie being rated V for violence, which they actually got in trouble for because the MPAA were like, well, you can't say that because that's not an official thing, so you have to take that off. But probably the most popular or the most famous kind of marketing gimmick was that when you went to see it in the theaters in the US, they would give you a free barf bag that had the poster image on it. So I always thought that was really fun. Now, I had actually seen Mark of the Devil a couple of times, many years ago. I even own a t-shirt. I'm not sure where it is. It's in one of my closet storage somewhere. And it has an image of the poster on the front. And when I watched it back then, I remembered it being a lot better than I expected. So I decided now was about time to, give it another go. I saw it come up on, I believe it was on Amazon Prime or something like that. It was somewhere on one of the streaming services I have so I could watch it for free. I think it was Amazon Prime. And honestly, I'm going to say, in spite of the lame dubbing, which I don't think that there's a version of this movie that was released that wasn't dubbed, much like Italian cinema, like Giallo movies and stuff that I review a lot. Basically, because the actors were from 12 different countries or something, everybody just either spoke in their native language or spoke in accent in English, and then they just dubbed everything into, I believe there's two versions. I believe there's an English dubbed version and a German dubbed version. Obviously, I watched the English dubbed one, and the dubbing is not great, but what are you going to do? It's dubbing. I can't stand it, but there's really no other way to watch it. So other than that, this movie is actually Again, like, much better than I remembered. It's pretty compelling overall, has some, pretty good gore sequences in it. It's pretty brutal, like, as far as the time period went. Has some decent acting performances in it. And the villains in it are great. Like, they're just, like, the worst, like, most hateable villains. And it's, like, the actors that play the villains, like, do a really good job. So at the start of the movie, there's kind of this little opening crawl of text. And it is explaining that the story is taken from the transcripts of 3 real trials. It's not an anthology film. They just weave all of the, supposedly real details, like, together, you know what I mean? Like, into one narrative. But then it goes on to make the pretty outrageous claim that over 8 million people were executed as witches, I'm presuming in the time period that this movie is set, which was like sometime in the 17th century. Yeah, it wasn't 8 million people. I mean, right. So, like, the historical consensus stands at more like around 60,000, which obviously is still like alarmingly fucking high and horrible, but it's significantly fewer than 8 million. So, it was bad enough. Like, you don't really need to exaggerate it. You know what I'm saying? So the story is set in a village. I don't think they ever named the village, but it's in the Alps, like in Austria. And after this kind of brief opening sequence where some guys like attack a convoy of wagons and rape some nuns, because yeah, we're diving right in, folks. It starts right away, and I'm just like, all right, here we go. We get introduced to this village's local witchfinder, who is this completely ruthless fuckhead whose name is Albino. And no, he's not an actual albino, that's just his name. But he is played by Reggie Nalder, who horror fans will recognize as the dude who played Barlow, the vampire, in the Tobe Hooper adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot from 1979. So he actually has, if you've seen the actor in real life, he does actually have like a lot of scarring on the bottom part of his face, which is why he usually played villains and monsters and things like that. That was kind of his niche. And he plays, like a really, really bad villain in this. Like, he's great. So Albino just abuses the shit out of his power, right? Basically, he will accuse anybody of witchcraft that pisses him off or, won't sleep with him is the main thing. So needless to say, the witch-burning fires in this village are, constantly going. They're just kept busy, you know what I'm saying? Now, Albino is illiterate, as many people in this era were. So he kind of has this fawning lackey type dude who's called the Advocate. And that guy is played by Johannes Bazalski, who I've seen in some other things, but I couldn't immediately place him. I don't think his character is ever given a name. He's always just called the Advocate. But he does kind of factor into the story like a great deal. So I think it was kind of weird that they didn't give a name, but I don't think they did. So it has come to pass that the prince of this region, who you never see, he has decided to, I guess, essentially federalize kind of the witch-finding industry. Because I guess it's their opinion that, well, if we're leaving the witch-finding to local dudes, then we're allowing witchcraft to, like, run rampant. Or I think probably their underlying motive is it's not bringing enough cash into the church, because that's what a lot of this bullshit was for, like, in real life as well as in this movie. So, therefore, you have this kind of regal dude named Lord Cumberland, who's played by Herbert Lom, and he's this very eminent scholar and famous witchfinder. So he's going to be showing up in this village to sort out its little witchcraft problem. Now, Albino, who is the local witchfinder, he is completely incensed about this, obviously, because not only does he not want anybody interfering with his little happy rape and torture heavy fiefdom he has going here that had no oversight, but also because when Lord Cumberland shows up, he's going to have to, he's going to be expected to hand over, all these written indictments for all of these witches that he executed, and he never bothered to do any of that. He just headed straight to the raping and then burning, you know what I mean? He's like, I didn't fill out any fucking paperwork, I don't need to do that. Like I said, there was no oversight. So he basically tells, because like I said, he can't write. So he tells the Advocate, you need to stay up all night and write a bunch of fake indictments ahead of Lord Cumberland arriving, so our asses will be covered, right? Now, before the big cheese shows up, though, Lord Cumberland, His much younger and much hotter protege, Count Christian von Mera, who's actually played by a very young and unbelievably gorgeous Udo Kier. I believe this was only his second or maybe third major film role. He's very young in this. So he shows up to make sure that everything is hunky-dory, like in regards to the accommodations they're going to be staying in and whatnot. Now, on his first day in the village, he's eating in this inn-type place and ends up locking eyes with this gorgeous barmaid named Vanessa. Now, she's played by Olivera Vuko, is I think how you pronounce her last name. That's how they credit her in this movie. She's actually now known as Olivera Katerina. I believe she's also a musician, but she's still around and still doing stuff. I believe she's Serbian, but I could be wrong about that. And she kind of like checks him out too, just like, so there's a little bit of a thing going on there between the two of them. Next day, though, Albino, who, like I said, is kind of cranky because he feels like he's maybe losing his job and like losing some of his power. So he comes sleazing into this tavern and essentially tries to rape Vanessa like in the back room because it's kind of implied earlier that he kind of has the hots for her, right? She ends up struggling and like slashing his face with a knife, and I was like, yeah, you go, girl, like don't fucking, but it's obviously it's good like that she did that, but it's like it's gonna bite her in the ass, and immediately it does, because he just drags her out into the dining room and just loudly proclaims to everybody in there, she's a witch, she did this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, what are you gonna do? Once you're accused, you're kind of fucked. So he even takes out his little witch poking needle thing. It's actually much bigger than a needle. It's a big poking tool or whatever, and he sticks it into this mole on her face, which actually when they did it, it's like obviously it's a retracting, but you can't really tell, like it looks good, like it looks like he's sticking it like way into her face, and she doesn't scream or anything, and so he's just like, look, she doesn't feel any pain, you know what I mean, because that's kind of what they did. And then he like rips open like her bodice, like of her dress. They don't show any boobies yet, they do later on, but well, she doesn't show her boobies, though. I think it's some of the other ones. But he starts poking her in the back, like, back, that with his little witch poker thing. And, but at that point, Udo Kier, Christian is his character's name, he shows up and puts a stop to all of these shenanigans. Now, he actually concedes to Albino that he's like, well, Vanessa, very well might be a witch, but Albino doesn't have a formal indictment or a formal accusation against her. And, you can't just go around poking at random people in public places like that, whether you think they're in league with the devil or not. It's just, that's not how it's done. There are rules to be followed before you can burn or behead an innocent woman. You know what I mean? It's basically that. So Christian also says when Lord Cumberland shows up, he'll be able to tell right away whether Vanessa is a witch or not, because he's just that fucking good, right? Now, obviously, Christian has taken quite a shine to Vanessa and vice versa. So he actually invites her back to the castle where he's going to be staying, and like Lord Cumberland is going to be staying like when he gets there. Now, during dinner, Christian is like very serious, and he seems to seriously believe that he's doing God's work, like learning to be a witch finder. He's kind of, he's kind of like a trainee witch finder, I guess. But Vanessa then very wisely asks him, well, how would you feel if your mom was accused of witchcraft and you had to torture and execute her? And Christian doesn't seem to have a real good answer for that, and you can tell that it's kind of starting the wheels turning in his brain a little bit. So after that, there's a little bit of a montage where, Christian and Vanessa are falling in love. They're like, frolicking through fields and splashing around in streams and whatnot. Vanessa is clearly kind of a free spirit type of woman and says things that she probably shouldn't, given the era that she lives in. And Christian tells her, you'd be wise to probably keep a lid on that shit, because you're going to get your ass, like, put up on a stake, like, yesterday. So Lord Cumberland eventually shows up, and he sets up shop in this castle. And all the accused witches from the village are kind of paraded in front of him, complete with their indictments, which, if you'll remember, are all faked. Like, they just quickly threw them all together, like, the night before. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was some research paper they had to do for a class. Now, at first, and I liked that the movie kind of does this, because they kind of make it seem, at first, like Cumberland is much better than Albino. Like, he's a lot more sober, and he seems like a lot more fair and not as overtly creepy or asshole-ish. And so, like, the first woman that they bring in front of him, he's like, oh, she's not a witch, and they let her go. You know what I mean? So you're kind of thinking, oh, just, this dude's okay. Maybe everything's going to be all right. No, it's not going to be all right. But, yeah. But so after that happens, they kind of, like, set you up to be like, oh, maybe this dude's all right. But soon enough, his kind of true nature starts to come to the fore, obviously. And it turns out that Cumberland is even worse than Albino in some ways, because he sort of couches his villainy in this veneer of, like, moral uprightness, and he's always very calm and he's very reasonable. Whereas, like I said, Albino is obviously a creep and a shithead, but it's more insidious because Cumberland is coming at it from a very, well, we have to be very reasonable about this and blah, blah, blah. But he's just as bad, you know what I mean? So the second woman that gets brought in front of him, whose name is Deidre von Bergenstein, I think is how you pronounce or how they said her name. And this might be based on a real person. Because like I said, some of the details of, these trials of these characters that got tortured and stuff, they did take them from actual witch trials from this era. So she gets accused of giving birth to the devil's child. So she tries to explain to them that the baby was actually from a rape that was perpetrated against her by a powerful man. I think it was a bishop, I think is what she said. Like, the bishop did it. And obviously, like, all the Witchfinder were like, oh, hell no, they are not having any of that. And they tell her in no uncertain terms, a man of God would never do any such thing. And I'm like, oh, Lord, no, of course they wouldn't. So, therefore, she must be a lying whore of the Dark One or whatever. So they send her off for several lively bouts of torture to get her to confess that the devil got her pregnant, like, consensually, like she was asking for it pretty much. So they put her in the thumb screws. They stretch her on the rack, which of course she has to be naked for, because movie. And eventually, like, toward the end of the movie, she actually gets her tongue ripped out by the root. And probably, I feel like that's the most famous scene from this. There's a lot of the images on the poster and stuff. It's actually a pretty decent effect. It happens, like, real quick, but they did a good job, like, with what they had. Because the budget for this was very, very small, but they did a good job, like, with the budget that they had. And I will say that despite all the shit that they do to this poor woman, she's kind of a badass because she just refuses to confess to what they want her to confess to, and so predictably, she eventually gets burned alive, because that's how shit rolled back then. And then after that, Vanessa gets dragged in front of Cumberland. And even though Albino actually went to the trouble of having the advocate draw up an indictment, it's implied that Christian kind of misplaced it, like, before Cumberland could see it, because he's like, well, there's no indictment here, and Albino's like, what the fuck, I did one and stuff. He's like, well, there's not one here, so there's nothing we can do about it. You know what I mean? I think he kind of stole it. So Albino obviously throws a shit fit about this because he thinks there's something up. And so Cumberland said, tell you what, we'll just throw Vanessa in the dungeon for now until another one can be written up and everything can be sorted out. So meanwhile, in another one of the cases, there's this nobleman named Baron Daumer, and he's played by an actor named Michael Mayen, I think is how you pronounce his last name, and I've seen him in some other stuff too. So he gets brought into the village on a cart. Now he's accused of being a sorcerer. Now the Baron, he already knows what's up. He's like, he just inherited this huge estate from his father, I believe, and obviously the church wants to get their grubby mitts on it. So if he gets executed for witchcraft, then they'll get all his land, right? Which, like I said, that was a very common thing that the church was doing back then. So Lord Cumberland basically straight up tells him, look, we're either going to torture you until you confess that you're a witch, at which point you can go free, but you're going to have to forfeit all your shit. Or you can deny the charges, get tortured and executed anyway, and the church will still get all his shit. So you know what I mean? They've just got it. They got you coming and going, basically. So Christian, Udo Kier's character, he sees all of this chicanery taking place. And, his feelings for Vanessa are also starting to deepen. So he starts to slowly realize, what an absolute scam all of this crap is, and how nobody actually believes any of the bullshit that they're spouting about these people being witches and stuff, but are basically just torturing and killing innocent people for their own selfish ends, whether that be financial ends or sexual ends or sadistic ends or whatever. And I'm just kind of like, duh, Christian, get on the clue bus, buddy. You know what I mean? It took you long enough. So, so his wavering conscience, I guess, is finally pushed over into, holy shit, what have I gotten myself into, when he accidentally witnesses his mentor, who he looked up to as like a hero, and he's just this paragon of virtue or whatever, Lord Cumberland straight up strangles Albino to death in a fit of rage after Albino implies that Cumberland is impotent, which seems to be a little bit of a sensitive area for Cumberland, I'm going to say, because it did come up, like, one of the witches that was brought, like, witches, I put in bunny rabbit ears, but one of the women that was brought up before, like, one of the accusations against her, oh, she made this whole town impotent, and he was like, what? She must be killed for, you know what I mean? So he's a little bit sensitive about how he can't get it up, you know what I mean? So there's that. So Christian, he sees this murder happen, and so he starts giving Cumberland some serious fucking side-eye, like, after that whole debacle, you know what I mean? But Cumberland kind of tries to, like, minimize the damage. Oh, doing God's work is so hard, you guys, and I'm only human after all, and other happy horse shit. And I was just like, yeah, nice try, Jackal. And then I'm going to say, in what I thought was the most blackly comic sequence, like, it's not funny because it's horrifying, and it's like, and it probably happened in real life. But it was still, like, kind of funny because it was so ridiculous. The advocate and his little gang of imbeciles, they see a bunch of kids playing in the street. Now, one of the kids has made what he calls a mouse out of, like, a handkerchief or something. It actually looked more like a bunny rabbit to me because it had long ears, but whatever. And then he starts telling the advocate, oh, I know all about magic. Like, you mean, like, magic tricks and stuff like that. So the advocate, who looks like he's just practically salivating at the thought of arresting more completely harmless people, so him and his posse chase the kids back to this nobleman's house and just plow their way inside. They don't knock or nothing, and they're like, hey, you can't come in here, and they're just like, fuck that, we're just coming in here. And they just come in here and go up the stairs and everything like that. And then they go in this room, which is like a parlor, and the parents of two, who are, like I said, I guess they're nobles of some kind, the parents of two of the kids are, like, giving a puppet show, like, for a bunch of other kids and their parents who are, like, sitting around. They have these two little wooden marionettes, and they're just, like, talking to each other. It's a puppet show. So, like, one of the puppets says something about wanting to be able to fly like an angel, not like an eagle. And the other puppet is like, oh, you're not good enough to be an angel. And then the other puppet is like, well, I guess maybe I can be a witch then. They can fly. And she's like, oh, you're not bad enough to be a witch. It's like this, it's very harmless little funny little conversation for kids or whatever. But of course, the advocate just goes completely apoplectic, not only because he thinks that the dialogue of the puppets is, like, sacrilegious or whatever, but because, and I'm not sure if this is, because he kind of seems like an idiot, you know what I mean? He seems to genuinely believe that the puppets are animated by witchcraft instead of by the two very obvious people, like, behind the stage, like, working the strings and talking, you know what I mean? Like, he thinks they're magical in some sense. And I was just like, does he really believe that, or he's just pretending? I'm not really, he seemed to, like, really believe it, which I thought was very funny. So yeah, so I'm like, this was very funny and, like, very absurd. But I am absolutely convinced, because like I said, I think this was partially based on a real trial. So I think that there were really people back then that would have thought that, like, that if you had puppets, that you're, like, magically animating them with black magic, like with witchcraft or whatever. And matter of fact, then I kind of depressed myself because I was like, man, there's probably people stupid enough to still believe that now. So I think we haven't really progressed all that much as a species, is what I'm saying. So the advocate and his little goons or whatever, they beat up the dad, who was one of the guys doing the puppets, and the mom, who was the other one who was doing the puppet. She's, like, trying to, like, fight him, like, get off my husband, you motherfuckers, or whatever. And, like, even the little son jumps in there, is like, stop beating up my daddy, you know what I mean? It's like, it was a whole thing. So the whole family, the mom, dad, and the two kids, it's like a son and a daughter, they get hauled off to the clink and accused of witchcraft for making puppets, like doing a puppet show. So Christian sees this whole farcical situation unfolding, and he goes into Cumberland's office, and he's like, you guys, like, for fuck's sake, it's like, please, these poor people, like, these innocent people, they weren't doing anything. They're just puppets. It's like, please let them go. And Cumberland says, I mean, he's just like like I said, he's the fucking worst. And I like that they kind of started out his character like he seemed like an okay dude, but then like he gets more and more monstrous like as the movie goes on. And he basically says, look, I know the family's innocent. I know those are just puppets. They're just made of wood. You know, there's no witchcraft or anything like that. But he's like, I'm going to execute them anyway because the advocate like went over his head or like did an end run around him or something like that and made an unauthorized public arrest. And since the whole village saw it happen and like knows about it, Cumberland doesn't want to be seen as soft on witchcraft by letting them go. So he's like, so I'm going to execute them anyway. I have to. And he's like, well, and Christian's like, but they're innocent though. He's like, well, then they'll be martyrs. So it's fine. Like it, you know what I mean? What's the harm? After all, Christian is understandably completely disgusted by this. And he sneaks down to the dungeon and busts Vanessa out. Because remember, Vanessa was down in the dungeon all this time. So the Baron, who is also still, you know, been in custody, he's also being tortured around this time. He gets like, they have that kind of, thing where they sit you on they kind of pull his pants down and then they put him on this bench with all the spikes on it, so all these spikes are going in his ass, and then they put his feet through these like stocks, and so they're like whipping the bottoms of his feet, and then they have him in the chair where they, you know, set a fire underneath and like you roast his nuts or whatever. So the Baron won't confess to anything either, and I'm gonna say, I know these are movie characters, but you really have to admire. Because I know that some people in real life like would absolutely not confess, like despite no matter how much they tortured them. And I was like, you have to really admire the fortitude and just the strength of the spite that it must take to like not give these fuckers the satisfaction of saying what they wanted you to say. Like even when you were being tortured, you know what I mean? So it's like, that's some badassery right there. So while all that's going on, like the puppet family is kind of also being given the business. The dad gets fastened to this chair, like with this iron contraption, and they're basically doing what they used to call Chinese water torture, where they just drip water on your head until you completely it just drives you insane. And it's like they show it, I guess they've been doing it for a long time, because it's like even there's like a little patch like where his hair is like worn away, so I guess he's been in there for a long time. So the mom, like that guy's wife, who is absolutely stunning, she gets brought into Cumberland's office, and he pretends to be really kindly at first and says, oh yeah, we know you're innocent, we're gonna let you go and all this other stuff. But then he like completely turns on a dime and then drags her into another room and just like savagely rapes her. Now the scene, it's not, I mean they show it, but it's not graphic at all, but it was suggestive enough that it made me like really uncomfortable to watch it. I have a problem like watching rape scenes in movies. It really bothers me. So even if they're not super graphic, if they are super graphic, then it's even worse. But like this one's not super graphic, but even so, I was still kind of like, you know what I mean? Like it really kind of upset me. So she then gets sentenced to be beheaded. And the Baron is also going to be beheaded too. So there's that. Now, meanwhile, Vanessa, like Christian was just like, get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? So she was able to escape. So she gets back to the village and she goes back into the tavern where she worked. And she gets up on a table and gives this real, like, rabble-rousing... So it's not even a speech because it's just super short. And she basically tells all these fucking shiftless villagers, please get off your drunk asses and storm that castle, get Lord Cumberland, kill him, torture him, he's the devil, all that kind of stuff. I mean, the villagers literally could have done this at any time. But no, I mean, they just kind of just sat around stuffing their face with bread and gruel or whatever the fuck until Vanessa, like the one hot brunette, who they all suspected of being a witch, by the way. Nobody helped her. She marches in, lit a fire under their butts, and then they became an angry mob like within 5 seconds. So I'm just kind of like, all right. They were just like, yeah. Like, I was like, why didn't you help her before when she was being tracked up? I don't know. Better late than never, I guess. So the mob sets out for the castle. You know, pitchforks at the ready. They don't need torches because it's daytime. But they, unfortunately, arrive too late to save Baron Daumer. Like, he gets his head chopped off, like, shortly before the platform gets overrun by the villagers. Now, the puppet lady, who's actually next on the docket to have her head lopped off, she's all right. And she gets away, and she eventually finds her unharmed children, like there's 2 kids, in the dungeon. I think her husband gets killed in the whole melee, though. So the villagers just go absolutely apeshit on the joint. They kill everybody they can find. But sadly, after a prolonged chase through the castle, Lord Cumberland is actually able to wedge his substantial bulk out of a window near his carriage, and he jumps in the carriage and beats cheeks like before anybody can catch him. So the whole main villain of the piece like escapes justice and presumably lives to torture again. So I'm just like, well, that was inspirational, wasn't it? But I'm sure like that's happened all the time, so it's just realistic, that's all. So the villagers, I guess because they couldn't get their hands on Cumberland, they then set their sights on Christian, Udo Kier. They either don't know or don't care that he has kind of seen the error of his ways and was trying to help them out, you know what I mean? So he gets strung, like dragged out, he gets put up on this cross contraption thing, and then the advocate has, I'm not really sure what the name of it is, I've seen it before, it's a pretty common torture device, and it's just kind of like this spiked pincher thing, like, and it goes around your midsection, and then they tighten it until the spikes like go into your internal organs, you know what I'm talking about. So they put one of those on him. So Vanessa, who was evidently some way behind all the other rampaging villagers, I mean, maybe it was on account of her having to run in a dress that looks like it weighs about 75 pounds. She's like, would you wait? Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? So she finally gets there, but she hears Christian like screaming in agony, obviously, and she rushes to save him. But by the time she gets there, it's too late. Like, he's already dead. So she's like sitting there kind of hugging him and weeping at the injustice of it all, while the villagers are kind of like scooting sheepishly away, being like, oopsie, you know what I mean? Sorry, lady, you know what I mean? And there they go. It's kind of like that kind of situation. So, like I said, Mark of the Devil, it's definitely one of the more brutal exploitation films of the time. I've seen way worse, but it's pretty bad. And the fact that it was shot in a real Austrian castle that contained real torture devices that were used during a particular witch panic, from this era, that definitely gives it a real air of believability. I mean, because they're using all the real shit. I mean, that's a real place where that happened. You know what I mean? Now, the torture sequences they're not, I don't know, maybe I'm jaded. I mean, to me, they're graphic, but they're not that graphic. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh my God, I can't watch. It's not like that. I mean, unless, like I said, maybe everybody's experience is different. Even though they're not super, super graphic, they're still pretty effective, I think. They just kind of show you enough to make it suggestive and be like, oh yeah, that looks like it would suck. You know what I mean? It does kind of really give you a sense of what it would be like to have been accused of witchcraft, like, during that time period. It would have sucked a lot. The acting in it seems pretty solid, especially the villains. Like I said, the guy that plays Cumberland and the guy that plays Albino, which, like I said, is Reggie Nalder. Now, admittedly, the dubbing makes it hard to tell, like, if the acting is good, because you're not hearing their real voices, but it seems to be, like, pretty solid, you know what I mean? And I'm gonna say, like, Udo Kier, I love him. I love him and everything, but he's, like, a real standout. Like I said, this was one of his very, very early film roles, and you can really easily tell by watching this movie that he was gonna be a big star, because every single time he's on screen, he's just, like, completely magnetic. Like, you can't look away from him, you know what I mean? He's very, very charismatic. I'm going to say the cinematography in this is actually, for as cheap as this movie was, it's actually really nice. Like, they utilized, particularly in the outdoor scenes, like these kind of mountainous, alpine, vistas. It's actually, they have like some really nice shots in this. So it doesn't look like a cheap exploitation film by any stretch of the imagination. They actually did put some effort and thought into it, Now, I suppose, and I have seen this argued, I suppose it could be argued that the movie was exploiting the very tragedies that it was seeking to condemn by showing them in essentially what was like a titillating kind of way. I didn't personally have an issue with that, with the approach of the movie. It's not like the filmmakers were really making anything up. I mean, stuff like this did happen, and I'm always just kind of like, well, maybe it's better to just show it without sugarcoating it, even if it does happen to appeal to someone's prurient interests or something like that. Like I said, everybody has their own thing. It's like, if you are kind of offended that they would show realistic stuff like that in a way that was kind of supposed to be titillating, then I can see why, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be offended. I can see why some people would see it that way. It didn't really bother me that much, but, I could see the other way too. So I'm going to say, like, anybody that has any interest at all in exploitation movies of the 70s, movies about witches or, the witch panics or anything like that, or if you're even interested in the video nasty panic, this movie was never prosecuted. I believe it was Section 3. where it was kind of on the list, but I don't think anyone was ever jailed for it or anything like that for having it. But like I said, when they first released it, it was like they cut 24 minutes out of it, and I bet I can figure out what 24 minutes they were too. But it's just like there wasn't much of a movie left because it's only like an hour and a half long. So yeah, so if you have any interest at all in anything like that, then you should definitely see this if you haven't. I mean, it's infamous for a reason. It's, probably not the best exploitation film from the period, but I mean, there's a reason that people still talk about it. You know what I mean? It's not the most disturbing thing I've seen, not by a long stretch. But I think it is like a really interesting relic of the era, and it's a surprisingly decent film. I just really feel like for its pedigree, if you want to call it that, is it salacious? Is it over the top? And, stuff like that. Yeah, but the quality of it is like much, much better than it really has any right to be. It's like a way better movie than you would expect, So that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below if you liked this movie review, and if have recommendations for other ones along these lines that you would like me to do. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.